We're going to talk about antisocial personality disorder. And when we're talking about antisocial personality disorder, we're not talking about not being shy or not wanting to be around other people, but more a kind of psychopathy. So we saw this diagnosis or a diagnostic criteria in the last video. Go back and look at it. So psychopaths. Hare talked about them as social predators who charm, manipulate, and ruthlessly plow their way through life, leaving a broad trail of broken hearts, shattered expectations, and empty wallets. Completely lacking in conscience and in feelings for others, they selfishly take what they want and do as they please, violating social norms and expectations without the slightest sense of guilt or regret. Whew. And if you look at some of the symptoms on the psychopathy checklist, you see a whole variety of symptoms that are really not very positive. Superficial charm, grandiose sense of self-worth, proneness to boredom, pathological liars, conning, remorse or lack of remorse, shallow affect, lack of empathy, etc. Again, look at the video posted on D2L and you'll see many of these showing up. Whiteham says, when we're looking at antisocial personality disorder, when we're looking at psychopaths, we're primarily looking at those people who end up in prison. And so she did some really interesting research where she put out an advertisement, wanted charming, aggressive, carefree people who are impulsively irresponsible, but good at handling people and at looking after number one. And from that point of view, we're going to be looking at a different population. So most of our population, or most of what we have done, is looked at criminals, and particularly those criminals with a certain pattern of problems. So not all criminals take advantage of other people. Some are white collar or do engage in white collar crime. Some engage, or some have driven while drunk. There are a variety of different kinds of things that people do, not all of which are consistent with an antisocial personality disorder. What Whiteham says is what we typically see are criminals, and particularly low-functioning criminals. So again, as you're looking at the video posted on D2L, that's clearly what you're going to see. We're not going to see those people with higher IQs who have more stable occupations and those who don't end up in prison. In fact, some of the kinds of characteristics that are characteristics of people who do not end up in prison may make them good attorneys, effective politicians, good in sales. So, again, think some about the role of context, how that plays out in terms of what we see, also in terms of our values and how where we're going from there. So causes of antisocial personality disorder. Certainly one piece seems to be genetic, that adopted away children of criminals were more likely to end up in prison, but only those who were in orphanages for a longer period of time. So that suggests something about an interaction between genetics and environment. And if you think about old-time orphanages, just do a search on Google for orphanages early 20th century, pretty appalling kinds of places Often children were held in orphanages for long periods of time with very little adult contact, very little encouragement of and love and nurturance. If we're looking at adoption studies, there are good correlations with birth parents' criminal behavior, but only for nonviolent crime. And you see some nice concordance rates, again suggesting some heritable component. Gee's work suggests that it might be a little bit more complicated than that. So one of the things that we have, as you're looking at the bottom here, so if we're thinking about the adoptees' antisocial behavior, certainly that's influenced by the birth parents' psychiatric disorders. But also think about, this nurture piece. And so the adoptive mother's disciplinary practices can influence their antisocial behaviors, which is influenced by what's happening in the marriage. Another set of explanations of antisocial personality disorder suggest underarousal. So that one explanation is that people with antisocial personality disorder engage in risk-taking in order to increase arousal levels to more optimal levels. So one of the things we know is that they're not as responsive to physical or social punishment unless aroused with adrenaline. So, when you're excited or afraid or whatever, your adrenaline levels are up. They are very responsive to a loss of money, but not so responsive, as we said, to other kinds of punishers. In general, remember from general psych that we want there to be a pretty small interval between behavior and either reinforcement or punishment. The greater the interval in general, the poorer the learning. But this is even more so for people with antisocial personality disorder. And think about what happens in the judicial system. Most people do not get, committed a crime and are not picked up and, never receive consequences, or a very small proportion of the time receive consequences. And even there, it may be a period of years before someone is picked up and goes to jail or prison. Another suggestion is cortical immaturity. So think about the cortex, that layering of the brain. In general, if we're looking at this group, there seems to be some immaturity in cortical responses. Their fear responses aren't as pronounced, and this seems to change across time, as do problem behaviors. Finally, here's our nurture, a really strong nurture piece. So as we're looking at the home lives of people with antisocial personality disorder, their home lives are really pretty awful. Think about, my guess is that some of you have done some reading or watched videos, documentaries on Charlie Manson. His home life was really awful. So we often see high levels of alcohol, fighting within the family, domestic violence, authoritarian parenting. You do this, rather than warm, nurturing kinds of parenting. Sexual promiscuity, neglect, and all of these were characteristic of Charlie Manson's early upbringing. If we're looking at children with histories of abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, they were much more likely to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder 20 years later, twice as likely. And if there was inconsistent discipline or very little discipline, they were at greatest risk for antisocial personality disorder in a 30-year follow-up looking at community mental health center records. Remember from your discussions in general psych or in developmental psych that what we want in terms of discipline is warm and limits. We don't want just do whatever you want. We don't want to be cold and severe and punishing. We want to set clear limits. We want our children to know what is expected of them and that we love them. Think about some of the ideas from this video. What did you think about the more positive view of psychopathy? One of the things I want you to be doing this semester is sort of playing with the ideas. Turn them upside down. What are the positive pieces? I think we can think about what the positive pieces of being anxious are and the positive pieces of being depressed. And then think about the explanations of antisocial personality disorder and what you would do to decrease antisocial personality in the larger culture of your community. Remember, we're going to be thinking about risk in our last assignment of the semester. And take care.